Episode 4, Professional Judgment. The Luke M. Perez Case Files open. Glass poured, let's talk academia. This is the Ivory Tower Files. Before we begin, a quick note. This episode discusses an alleged physical altercation involving a university faculty member. The information presented here is based on publicly available reporting, court proceedings, media coverage, and institutional materials. The purpose of this discussion is analysis, commentary, and education. It is not legal advice, and it is not a final judgment on disputed facts. And before we get into tonight's file, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and please leave a comment. I want to hear how you're thinking about these cases, because this series is meant to be a conversation, not just a broadcast. Tonight, we're pouring a smoked black Manhattan, bourbon, Amaro, bitters, and just enough smoke to linger a little longer than it should. It's the kind of drink you sit with when what you're looking at isn't complicated, but the implications keep unfolding the longer you think about it. This episode is about professional judgment. And more specifically, it is about what happens when someone whose academic work and professional training are built around understanding judgment, restraint, and decision-making under pressure makes a decision that runs directly against those principles in a moment where the outcome was entirely predictable. The case takes us to Ohio State University in February of 2026, and to Luke M. Perez, a first-year assistant professor at the Salmon P. Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society, a center explicitly designed to teach civil discourse, intellectual diversity, and the practice of engaging disagreement through reasoned dialogue rather than force. And to understand why this case lands the way it does, you have to look closely at both the institution and the individual. The Chase Center's mission is not subtle. It is built around free and open inquiry, the exchange of ideas, the development of informed citizenship, and the expectation that disagreement is handled through structured civil engagement. Its curriculum emphasizes primary texts, debate, leadership, and the ability to articulate competing viewpoints in a way that reflects intellectual discipline and mutual respect. In other words, it is not just teaching what to think, it is teaching how to engage. And Perez's role sits directly inside that mission. His research focuses on American grand strategy, the ethics of war, religion and international politics, and the study of decision-making across time. His work examines how leaders operate under pressure, how they manage escalation, and how they balance competing demands in moments where the stakes are high. He trained at Villanova University and University of Texas, held faculty positions at Arizona State University and the University of Missouri, and entered Ohio State in a position that, by most academic standards, is both visible and well-positioned. Layer on to that more than a decade in the Air National Guard, and what you have is someone whose professional identity across disciplines is built on the ability to recognize tension and not escalate it unnecessarily. So when you look at that profile, you are not looking at someone who should be surprised by how quickly a situation can get out of control, which is what makes what happens next so difficult to reconcile. After hosting a guest lecture featuring E. Gordon G., a figure deeply familiar with scrutiny, controversy, and media engagement, Perez steps into a hallway where journalists and a documentarian, Michael Newman, are attempting to ask follow-up questions. And it is worth pausing on G for a moment. G has spent decades in leadership roles across major universities, navigating public controversies, responding to criticism, and managing relationships with donors and stakeholders. He has been the subject of scrutiny before, sometimes for his own statements, sometimes for broader institutional issues, and he is accustomed to being questioned in public settings. That is part of the role. So when journalists approach him after a talk asking about student loan debt or institutional decisions, that is not an unexpected situation. That is routine. Newman, by his own account in court, was there to ask those questions. He was legally permitted to be in the hallway, had no prior relationship with Perez, and has stated that he was not attempting to film Perez at all. And this is where the broader context begins to shape how everything is interpreted. Because some of the questions circulating in that environment involved donor relationships and institutional connections, including those tied to Jeffrey Epstein. Now, it is worth being clear about why that matters. Epstein was a financier who became the central figure in a massive sex trafficking scandal involving minors, and his case drew global attention not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of the extensive network of powerful individuals connected to him across politics, finance, and higher education. So when his name comes up, it is not just about one person. It signals a broader concern about institutional judgment, about proximity to power, and about how universities respond when those connections come under scrutiny. And we are going to explore that much more directly in the next episode, because episode 5 is a two-part case focused on Larry Summers, a prominent academic leader whose connections to Epstein became a major issue within higher education. For now, what matters is that those questions about donors, about accountability, are not out of bounds. They are expected. And that is why what happens next becomes so consequential. The video shows Perez stepping in, blocking access, telling Newman that the interaction is over. At that point, everything is still manageable. Faculty intervene in awkward situations all the time. Conversations end. People move on. But then, in a matter of seconds, it escalates. He makes physical contact. He grabs the camera. He takes Newman to the ground. And once that happens, once it is recorded, once it circulates, once it reaches millions of views and becomes part of national media coverage, there is no containing it. Within a day, Perez is placed on administrative leave. The case moves into the legal system. He appears in court, pleads not guilty, and a temporary protection order is issued. Newman describes both physical impact and ongoing fear, including concern about retaliation, while Perez's legal team seeks additional footage and prepares its defense. And as of the date of this episode, Perez is permitted to be on campus for employment-related and medical purposes while the investigation continues. So this is still unfolding. But even in an ongoing case, there are moments that define everything that follows. And this is one of them. Because this is not a complicated situation. Public hallway. Journalist asking questions. Camera recording. You step away. That is the baseline. And what makes this case particularly difficult to process inside academia is that this is someone whose entire body of work is built around understanding how to avoid exactly this kind of escalation. Which leads to the central question. Why risk this? Why risk a position like this, at this stage, in a role that is explicitly about modeling civil discourse and the ability to engage disagreement? Because this is not just a misstep, it is a contradiction. A faculty member at a center dedicated to civil dialogue responding to a question with physical force. And that raises a broader institutional question. Does this behavior align with what the center claims to teach? From a faculty standpoint, the implications are immediate. If you are a student, you are now learning about civil discourse from someone whose public response involved escalation. If you are a colleague, you are thinking about whether this is someone who can represent the center and the institution in public-facing environments. And if you are reviewing this file for retention or promotion, especially this early in a career, the evaluation shifts. First-year assistant professor, administrative leave, active legal case, widely circulated video. That becomes the central narrative. And once that narrative is established, it is extraordinarily difficult to move it to the margins. So what happens next? The legal process continues. The university investigation proceeds. There may be termination, non-renewal, or a negotiated exit. But even before those outcomes are finalized, one thing is already clear. The trajectory has changed. And in academia, especially this early, that kind of shift is rarely reversible. For junior faculty, the lesson here is direct. You do not get a private version of yourself in public. You do not get a second standard when cameras are present. And you do not get to separate your professional identity from your behavior when everything is visible. Judgment is not something you write about. It is something you demonstrate. If you've made it this far, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and please leave a comment. I want to know how you're thinking about this. Does this feel like a one-time failure of judgment or something that raises deeper concerns about alignment between institutional values and individual behavior? Before we close, a final note. This episode is based on publicly available reporting, court proceedings, and institutional materials, and is intended for analysis and educational purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice or a definitive account of disputed facts. That's the file for today. Finish your drink. Glass empty. Files closed. Next file, Episode 5, Part 1, Power, Donors, and the Epstein Connection, the Summers Case. This is a two-part case. Part 1 will focus on Epstein's connections to elite academic institutions. Part 2 will examine Harvard, Summers, and institutional accountability. So make sure you're subscribed because that one picks up exactly where this leaves off. And for that, we're going to need another pour.